Welcome back to my channel, everybody. Before we jump in, I want to make sure you do 3 things for me. Go ahead, step 1, smash that like button. Step 2, hit subscribe. And finally, step 3, ring that bell so you get notified every time I post a new video. 3, 4, maybe 5 times a week. Last but not least, huge shout out to my Patreon fans. Check out my Patreon page for exclusive content and merch. Cool. Baller. All right. That felt like a YouTube intro? Yeah. Okay, good. We'll make it just as cheesy and awful as we can throughout the year. Sorry, cringy might be the word nowadays. All right. So, here we are. We are going to start 1.2. And what color am I using? Would you like me to use, rather? Black and yellow, black and yellow. Okay, we'll use black today. We'll do black and yellow. I'm cool with that. All right, we are going to look at 1.2, which means we're in which chapter? And which section? Lesson 2. That is correct. Okay, so in 1.2, we are going to be looking at a big idea, and we are going to be discussing the nature of science. Okay. So the nature of science is going to be our big idea today. So right off the bat, our first main section indicated by this lovely bullet point, we are going to be asking a simple question. The question at hand, we talked about what is biology and what is life. That's the first thing we talked about, right? Now we're going to ask the question, what is science? My first thought, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume you guys probably have an idea in your head of what science is. Okay, I'm going to give you like 30 seconds to a minute. Talk amongst the 3 of you. Try to come up, without just reading the definition in the book, what's science? Don't just read the definition, bam, bam. Okay, what's science? That's a question. I'm going to give you 45 seconds, starting now. Easy question, hard question? We'll see. What's science? What'd you guys come up with? Sure. Let's hear it, Bam Bam. What's science?
To me, I think like how humans evolve throughout time and learning new stuff about how they could adapt to the earth. So they like before time, like I think cavemen started as cavemen.
Sure.
Oh, we started from our first kind of science, like making weapons, I think, and hunting.
Yeah, I would agree. So you're saying it's, I'm going to summarize that and change the language a little bit. But what I picked up from what you just said is the development of technology for people, essentially. And it's a process, right? I even heard you say, I was not trying to eavesdrop, but I did hear the word over centuries as you guys were talking. Yeah, 100%. You're right. That's a good part of it. What else? Whomever. Like, we're open for them, guys.
The study of everything on like humans, space, and nature.
Okay, I agree with you. We're gonna dive in a little bit deeper into that. The study. What does it mean? What do you mean by the study? How does it be studied? That was weird wording. So we're learning about stuff through studying it in some sort of fashion, right? Now, you don't need to write it down, but the Greek word for science and where we get it from is scientia. Scientia is what this was known as like 3,000 years ago when this first idea started showing up in writing. Literally, in Greek, means knowledge. So science originally was just knowledge. They were equal to one another. Now, in our purposes, you guys hit on so many of the ideas that are super important, and it shows me that, yeah, you get a good feel for it. You have a good understanding, but we need a formal definition to work with. So, for our purposes, we're going to define it right off the bat. Science. And you will hear bits and pieces of what you guys just told me. When we talk about science, we are looking at the use. It is the use of evidence. So we need evidence of some sort. We can't just make up ideas. It's the use of evidence to construct or create, if you'd rather, because that word might make a little bit more sense, It's the use of evidence that we obtain somehow to create, and really important, we're going to underline this, testable. And I'm going to underline it because it is so important that we be able to test these ideas. We create testable explanations or predictions in the natural world. Okay, evidence gathered over long amounts of time, maybe. Testable explanations. Will this material work better for a tool than that other material? And being able to test that and make that determination in our natural world. Now, you'll often hear me say that natural phenomena instead. Phenomena, just events that are occurring, right? Okay, so as we go through here, this is what I want us to actually think of it. The fact that it is using evidence to create new ideas or explanations that we can test to see if that is supported or not. Now, within here, a couple different ways we can go, and I'm going to change the order here. When you learned about this last year, I imagine you've probably heard the language, the scientific method. Maybe. Maybe not. Or whatever. However it gets worded before. What I want to look at, and we're going to use some fancy language, is within here, I want us to think about scientific inquiry, which, what is inquiry? And that's okay. We don't have to define it. I'm just going to write it down. This is like questioning. Having an inquiry or being inquisitive is like having wonderment and saying, hey, what's, why, how, when, like all those sorts of things. Scientific inquiry as a process. Now, I'm going to write the word process, but I want you to know that when it's presented, like as I'm going through your text, because I'm using this as a guide, they use the word framework. A framework or a process with which we can question things scientifically. Now, as we go through here, there are, you might see this as scientific method, we're just avoiding that language, they're all the same thing. Most scientists around the world will agree that there's a process and it essentially follows this order. However, sometimes it might deviate or change a little bit, depending on the situation. Maybe we do slight differences, but in the end, we're doing the same big process. So if we wanted to do some sort of scientific investigation into something, what's the first thing, like, is there anything in the natural world that you guys wonder about? The why, the how, the what, anything. I don't care what it is. It has to be a natural phenomenon. There's not a wrong answer here. Just something in nature that you're like, that's pretty freaking awesome, but I don't know at all how it works.
Like when you see a slope line like going down, but the water's going down.
Oh, so those are unique situations. So maybe you're saying, what determines which direction water flows? Now, that all of a sudden makes it scientific, right? So I would be wary that you may see optical illusions from time to time, because 99% of the time, if I have an incline or a slope and I put water right here, it does what? It goes down. Now, there might be some specific situations where you might see it turn and go back up, and that's really weird to see. But it begins with seeing something like that that just makes you go, what? Right? Like, that's the first step. So when we're running through this process or this framework of scientific inquiry and questioning, we always begin in one of two ways. We start by making this kind of big idea and this excitement, for lack of a better word, to do one of two things. We ask a question. Now, depending on how you want to produce this, I'm going to think back to our global problems that we're looking at. So a question might be, is there a better way to produce energy rather than burning oil, right? Like, that's a valid question. And we're not going to write this down. That one is going to be easier to work with through this whole thing. Now, oftentimes, instead of saying ask a question, which eventually we'll need to, but it might just boil down to find something that's a problem and identify it as a problem. So whether we think of this as actually asking a specific question or stating a problem, they're going to take us down this same process to attempt to answer it. So whether it's what energy is better than just burning oil, maybe it's we're running out or it's too expensive to burn oil. Like, we need to solve this problem. And those are two ideas that are focused around the same thing. So if we have asked a question about this, sometimes you are the very first human being to ever ask that question. Sometimes you're not. More often, do you think you are the first person to ever have that thought, or have other people had it? What's more likely? Probably other people have had it, right? So we always start with asking this question. Now, depending on how specific we're going to go, but we're going to do research. So we'll say, hey, we start by asking a question, and then we research what others have found or learned. That's probably the better way to word it. Let's find out what somebody else has learned by asking this question. Okay, sometimes you'll find that somebody might have asked that exact question and they have learned something about it. Does that just mean, man, that sucks, I can't learn anything about it? If somebody else already answered the question and they said, hey, here's my answer, does that mean that you just give up? Like, oh, good, that's the end of everything. We understand everything. No, absolutely not. Your research that you might do, and we'll do some of this together, obviously, we need to use what other people have found. Then we need to look closely at how they've gone through, and maybe are there changes that don't fit exactly with the question I want. So we found a problem or a question. We've researched maybe what other people have learned in investigating it themselves. Beyond that, we need to come up with our own explanation. So there's a really specific word. We're going to say we ask a question, we do the research, and then we form, and this is going to be a fancy word, our own. What is our prediction or our suggested answer or explanation to a problem or scientific question? Starts with an H and ends with hypothesis. Boom. We form our, and I'm going to sneak this in as a vocab, hypothesis. Okay. This is easy to misconstrue or to confuse what a hypothesis actually is. Oftentimes, especially at earlier ages, you are told that a hypothesis is simply an educated guess. Okay, you've probably heard that, maybe you haven't. I'll tell you, hypotheses, which is the plural, they are more than just a guess. Like, we're not just taking a shot in the dark that's kind of based on our research. When we form our hypothesis, what we are really looking for, and I'm just going to sneak in a definition right here. Our hypothesis is a testable, so it has to be testable, explanation Now, I would say or answer, but I'm just going to use explanation here. It's a testable explanation based on logic. So we can't just pick it out and say, hey, like if we think about is geothermal better for the environment than gas? We can't just say the testable explanation would be like a hypothesis is gas is better because it's easier to get. Well, maybe, but how do you test really how easy something is to get? Like that question isn't clear. We need to have a reason based on logic, like real true reasoning as to why we think this is the answer. It's not a guess, it's an informed explanation. Okay, with this, when we make our hypothesis, that is our testable explanation, we now have it in front of us. We've asked a question, we've done our research, and now we say, I think it's because of this. How do we start to decide whether or not our hypothesis is on the right track or not? Like, if I think, like this is just going to be a silly one. I wonder what happens if I let go of these scissors. Okay, that's a question, right? Have any of you guys ever let go of something you were holding? And what happened? Okay, it fell. Now, does that guarantee to me that that's going to happen? Really? Like, that makes me 100% certain that that's what's going to happen. I really wish I had a helium balloon at this point in time. Really wish I had one. Okay, but I think it's reasonable. I might hypothesize, I think this will fall. Right? That's reasonable. Okay, am I done? Like that's science? We're done? No, what should I do? If I say, I think this will fall because gravity is really why I think it will fall. Oh my gosh, how do I test it?
Just letting it go.
Okay, it did. Awesome. That was a really easy example. We had our hypothesis and we did what, Jade? Holy test. Now, as we look at this, we're going to make this one of two things because sometimes it can be as simple as a test like that. Now, we can test in a few different ways. We can test our hypothesis, which if I shorthand hype, do you know what it's short for? Hypothesis. I would say let's do this. We will test our hypothesis through one of two ways are essentially what we're going to use in here. It can either be experiments that we will conduct, which me dropping those scissors was like a lazy experiment, or sometimes we're wondering something about the natural world and we want to see how it actually works in nature, so it doesn't make sense for me to like set up an experiment to do it because then that's not the natural world. Instead, is it possible that if I'm trying to figure out, like, I don't know, how orangutans live in nature, I'm not going to go get an orangutan and take it to the zoo and watch it. That's asking the question or answering the question, how do orangutans act in the zoo? That's a different question. If I want to know how it works in nature, or how they live in nature, I can't do an experiment. What am I going to do? I'm going to go there and do what? Yeah, I'm going to live around them. I'm going to examine them. I'm going to say observe is a word that I'm going to use, but examine is all the same. So we're going to test this hypothesis through either experiments or observations. Okay. Now, as we are testing these things, regardless of the case, I guess, especially if we're going to run an experiment of some sort, there are a few things that we need to pay really careful attention to. The participants that we select really matter. If I want to know how kids in Alaska behave and I only pick boys, is that really going to answer the question about how students at our school behave if all I do is test and look at and watch all the boys? No. Why? Yeah, that's not really the population, right? We're only picking some of them. So when we're looking at this, we're going to pay careful attention to subject selection. So whether we're talking about people or animals or bacteria or cells or in the world of physics, any mass. Whoa, subject is the word I meant to say there. Subject selection matters. And there's obvious issues that we could probably come to conclusions and be wrong about them, but they're justified by evidence, and all of a sudden our science just isn't science anymore. Okay, when we're have our subjects selected, no matter what it is, let's say we're looking at the student population here, or we're looking at power plants in different places. As we go through this, we're going to collect a ton of data. Now, we need to make sure that the data that we're collecting is relevant. So collected data must be relevant. Now I'm going to jump back to that orangutan problem. Do you guys know orangutan, because there's no G on the end of it. Orangutan. Do you guys know where orangutans live? Do they? I don't know exactly. I would assume that probably in Africa. But I'm pretty sure that there's orangutan in some Southeast Asian countries as well. I don't know about South America. We'll Google it here in a second because I don't know. But let's say that I'm somewhere and I'm, observing and watching this tribal behavior of all these orangutans, and all of a sudden in my data I start including, today I had mixed berries and nuts for breakfast. And I do that, and today I had scrambled eggs. Is that data?
No.
I mean, it is data, but is it relevant? No, not at all. We need to make sure that the data that we're collecting is relevant to the question that we're asking. Now, beyond this, we've run our tested. We have collected a bunch of data. We must analyze that data and form conclusions. So we will analyze data And this, especially at our level, will consist of only a couple things that we really need. For our analysis, in a physics class, you might be like very explicitly looking at measurements of how fast something goes, how long it took, all of that. That's the data that would matter. For our purposes, whenever the data might be, we need to format it. Format in a way that allows logical or logically, and we're going to sneak in a new word here, I think. We have our data and we've collected it. We then need to analyze it. And in analyzing it, what we're really trying to find is a format in a way that allows us to logically infer. Have you guys heard the word infer? An inference. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. It's just to reach a conclusion. So we're going to say format in a way that allows logically inferred conclusions. Now, a logical conclusion is an inference, so I'm not going to like speak any more there. We have some sort of logic that led us to this. Okay, once we're there, couple important things to look at. Is it possible that our hypothesis that we're trying to get evidence for, we go through all this whole process and we get to the end and go, ah, crap, my hypothesis was wrong? Could we be like completely wrong from our first explanation? Does that mean we're bad at science? No, because there's two options. Once we're here, we've analyzed, we've reached a conclusion. If the hypothesis is supported, what would you do? Say it again. Present, right? So if it's supported, we will do two things. One, I'm going to make a colon so that we have a list. If we have a supported hypothesis, step one is we repeat as best we can. Repeat or replicate. Now, depending on the situation, this can be easier said than done, because if I have some big study that's taken me 4 decades to like fully complete, I probably am not going to live another 4 decades to be able to completely replicate this. If we are able to do that and it's supported, we then publish. And who checks my work? Because maybe I walked in with a ton of like preconceived thought and I knew the answer that I wanted to get at and I wanted my explanation to be correct. And maybe I tweaked the data to make it look correct. Who's going to check my work? So writers, so let's say we're doing a specific wildlife biology thing, and I publish a paper on wildlife biology. I should have wildlife biologists check my work, right? So other experts in the field. And what we know that as is publish and peer review. We need somebody to check it. Now, that's the best case scenario if the hypothesis is supported. And I want to be really, really specific. Did I say if our hypothesis was true? We look for support for it because we're never going to be able to decide definitively that this is true. All that I can say is that, hey, the evidence supports this. Okay. Hypothetically, though, we've gone through that whole thing and our hypothesis is false. And I'm going to say, instead of that, not supported. What happens when we run through this whole process and our hypothesis or our logically inferred explanation is not supported by the evidence we've collected? There's really two options, and they're both fantastic. The first one is publish. So, if you are just done with the question, which hopefully you're not, because as scientists, our goal, remember, scientia is to gain knowledge and expand understanding. If we say that, hey, we were wrong, have we gained knowledge? Yeah. We may not understand, overall we probably understand it a little bit better, but we don't really have the answer to the original question. So maybe we publish and review it still, which would be awesome. But step two, if I really want to try to keep answering that question, I simply form new hypothesis and I retry. Because if our goal is to answer a question and we've said, oh, it's not this, we haven't answered the question, but we've certainly added knowledge. We are there. Okay. Now, when we do this, in either case, these ultimately, this whole process, this is a scientific method or a framework of scientific inquiry, this leads to inevitably an expansion of knowledge. So we're going to say knowledge expands when current beliefs are challenged. The holy grail of science isn't to understand everything perfectly. The holy grail in my mind is challenging and showing that what we all thought to be the case is not. We need to challenge ideas. Now, as we go through here, I have a lot more to talk about, but we're out of time. Does this look like stuff you've seen before?
Yeah, kind
Stellar. If not, that's also fine with me because we're all jumping in here. You guys have a wonderful weekend. Class is over. Yeah. This class goes so fast. Again, I know I say it. I try to